Small crowd.
Who's going first?
Doesn't matter.
No.
Oh, no. Oh, yeah, I'll go from the other side. So we'll get started, and let me first of all welcome you to this discussion entitled Autonomous Weaponry in Armed Conflict, which is co-sponsored by a host of groups, namely the ASIL Government Attorneys, the International Law and Technology Group, the International Legal Research Group, and UN 21 interest groups, and the ASIL Libre Society on the Law of Armed Conflict. Thank you very much. I've been told to make two announcements. If you are here for a CLE credit, you need to scan in, which is hopefully will not result in an uncomfortable moment where everyone now gets up and runs to the back of the rooms and comes back. But if you want to do that, then you need to sign in and sign out, apparently. With that being said, I think I've taken care of that duty. So what we're trying to do here is not a traditional panel, despite the fact that we sit behind tables, but we want to have a conversation amongst all of us, which includes you, the audience. And I will try to at least attempt to keep some order in all of this. What we'll do is we'll only have very brief introductions of no more than 5 minutes by the panelists, and then we'll try to have an active discussion amongst the four of us, as well as you, and I hope and I invite you to participate. There are microphones on the left and the right. After introducing the speakers, I'll lay out the topics. Starting on my far left is Colonel Richard Jackson, and who's the Special Assistant to the U.S. Army Judge Advocate General for Law of War Matters. He served in this position since 2005, when he retired from the U.S. Army after 30 years in uniform. He, at a former point in his life, was also the chair of International and Operational Law Department of the Army Judge Advocate General School in Charlottesville, Virginia, and has written extensively in professional publications and lectured around the world on law of war issues. I can't pass this up because Dick was also the chair of the Libre Society interest group of the American Society from 2010 to 2013, and I should probably flag that I will only have introduced them with abbreviated bios as we agreed beforehand. John Canning is next. He's a combat systems engineer for autonomous weapon systems at the Naval Surface Warfare Center. I do have to point out that he speaks in his individual capacity here and not as a official spokesperson. His bio is extensive as well. He's a leading role in pursuing the weaponization and safety of unmanned systems at the national and international levels. His background is a bachelor degree in mechanical engineering and a master's degree in information systems. We're very pleased to have him here because we think that we lawyers should every now and again be informed by actual engineering matters, and in this particular instance, that's incredibly necessary. Finally, we have Naz Modiazadeh, who's a senior fellow at the Harvard Law School Brookings Project on Law and Security, where she leads the Counterterrorism and Humanitarian Engagement Project. She regularly advises international humanitarian organizations, UN agencies, and governments on issues related to IHL, LOAC, human rights, and counterterrorism regulation. All right. Now, let me just briefly lay out some of the issues. Autonomous weapon system, I think it's safe to predict that we'll see a debate that, at least in structure, we've had before, namely that we're seeing with drones at the moment. It's a rather already a topic that's debated with relatively strong views. And about 5 years ago, when I started my journey on this topic, I needed to actually convince an audience for about 5 minutes that this is a real topic. I think by now we no longer have to do that, and I'm quite glad that that's not necessary. But what we're trying to do is to bring some clarity into this debate. What we'll cover is, number one, what are autonomous weapon systems to begin with? Number two, we'll talk about the challenges that autonomous weapon systems pose with respect to international humanitarian law and human rights law. We'll briefly touch on questions of individual and criminal responsibility, certain policy considerations, and the current discourse as it happens. From my personal perspective, the debate, and somewhat similar to the drone debate, is sometimes fraught with certain misconceptions. And on one side of the spectrum, you find those who are fully in favor of autonomous weapon systems, and on the other side, you see those who are fully against it. And we have designed this panel in some ways to actually leave both of these ends of the spectrum out of the equation. And so, to some extent, your position on that spectrum, I think, depends to a large extent on two factors. Number one, what you think of the technological feasibility, which we want to touch on, and also certainly on the normative approach to whether conflict should be handed over to autonomous systems, at least in part. And that middle ground that I think we want to discuss may be less appealing in the public eye, but I think it's the area that this event purposefully occupies because, at least to my mind, it doesn't make much sense to speak at the margins of that spectrum. Another safe prediction, I think, is that we'll see the introduction of autonomous weapon systems very slowly into the military. They won't just come in and take over, but we'll see that slowly. And the reason why I think lawyers need to get into this debate reasonably early as opposed to previous times is that the programming takes place now. And the programming over what kinds of rules with respect to, say, distinction, proportionality, individual responsibility, needs to be talked about fairly early on, and I think needs to be informed by an interdisciplinary debate. With that, I'll stop, and I'll hand over to Dick Jackson. Like I said, each panelist gets about 5 minutes, no more than 5 minutes. I'll pull my Germanic heritage out, and we'll stop you literally at 5 minutes. So. Dick Jackson.
Great. I'm happy with that, Marcus. Thank you. I have to first start and say that I'm here in my personal capacity. These are just the opinions of Dick Jackson. They aren't the opinions of the U.S. government or the Department of the Army where I work. But these the points I'm going to bring up are based on my experience within government in 3 different areas. The first is I provide the weapons reviews for the Department of Army. So I have clients that work at places like Picatinny Arsenal that develop weapons systems, including robotic weapon systems. And so I'm the equivalent of John's lawyer, but I'm in the Army. John has a similar lawyer in Department of the Navy in Code 10, essentially. And in 2006, I reviewed SWORDS, and I can't remember what that acronym means, but it's a cool acronym, and but it is a robotic weapon system that mounts a M60 or squad automatic weapon, a machine gun, on a platform that is remotely controlled. So the operator can be protected from direct attack by using this weapon system. The other weapon system that is much closer to what we'll describe shortly as autonomous weapons is CRAM, the Counter Rocket Artillery Mortar System that we employed in Iraq and Afghanistan to defend our forward operating bases. And the nature of the problem there was we were being attacked by mortars, rockets, sometimes even artillery, but usually from populated areas, and the individuals attacking would shoot and scoot. They'd shoot and move, and leaving the civilian population there to be threatened by a counter artillery battery fire, which is the standard doctrine of the military. I had a hard time persuading my boss when I was a division SJA to not fire battery 3 against an incoming mortar or artillery round. What's battery 3? That's all 5 tubes firing 3 rounds at the precise location where that incoming mortar attack came from. So CRAM is a force protection measure, but it's to avoid the indiscriminate or disproportionate civilian casualties that might result from a normal doctrinal response. and I'll talk about that, CRAM's autonomous functions in a little bit. Second area I've worked is in the U.S. Defense Department's Undersecretary of Defense for Policy's working group on autonomous weapons. And this was led by a young man named Paul Schera, a combat veteran that now is an analyst in the policy arena. He led an 18-month working group to define autonomous weapons and develop the Department of Defense Directive that came out almost 18 months ago now. And we can talk about that more later too. But first we looked at a number of different current technologies that were being employed, and then looked at what caused errors with the use of those technologies. For example, the shoot down of the Vincennes many years ago, or two uses of a anti-aircraft system that accidentally shot down 2 British Tornadoes during the Gulf War. And then we focused on what measures can be taken to prevent catastrophic or errors or mistakes in the use of those weapons with some autonomous functions. And we developed a standard that defined autonomous weapons as those that select and engage targets. That's because we wanted to focus on the most critical aspect of autonomy, that where both human judgment and the law of armed conflict applies. And finally, I've been a member of the U.S. delegation at CCW, the Certain Conventional Weapons Convention, in the past, and I've been working with our current delegation to present the U.S. view and position on these weapons at an upcoming discussion about autonomous weapons in May. Now, that's been preceded by a Chatham House discussion a month ago, an ICRC-led discussion last week, and so autonomous weapons and the regulation of autonomous weapons potentially has been a matter of discussion in the international community recently. So I think we can explore that a little bit more today.
And thanks for keeping us on time. This is perfect. John Canning.
Oh, very good. Is this working?
Yes.
Get somebody nodding in the back row there? Great. All right. I have to see about echoing Dick's comments here with respect to the fact that my comments and opinions are my own and do not necessarily reflect official position of the U.S. Navy or any other U.S. government agency. However, I will say that I began working on the autonomous use of weapons in late 2002. I had just returned to the Naval Surface Warfare Center, Dahlgren Division, from being a science advisor to a 4-star admiral down in Norfolk for 2 years. And my management suggested to me that it might be a good idea if I started looking at this particular problem. And since I had looked at some autonomous systems a lot earlier in life, hadn't really done too much with them, but it did pique my interest, so I thought I'd see about working on it. And the issue, of course, is the fact that ultimately it's engineers like myself that have got to see about sitting down and designing and building these damn things that you can take them out and use them in the fields safely. So it wasn't too long after we started digging into this that we kind of came to the conclusion that maybe some of the legal issues were going to be some of the hardest things we had to see about solving. So on the 23rd of September 2003, we met with both representatives from the Navy JAG office and the OSD Office of General Counsel. And I got off on the wrong foot with these guys to begin with when I said, you know, what are your concerns with respect to having robots that are armed? And there was a Marine Corps major from the Navy JAG office. Guy didn't skip a beat. He said they could kill people. So there's two initial thoughts that went through my head very quickly in close succession. One was war is hell, and the second one was men die. So I said, seriously, what are your concerns? The reply was, that's it, they could kill people. And the rest of that day, we had an extremely good discussion with those guys. We not only understood at the end of the discussion what their position was, but more importantly, why they held it, and that is really what has driven us. One of them told me something that has stuck with me a long time. He said, "The ultimate goal in warfare is not to kill the enemy, but to bring hostilities to a complete and lasting close as quickly and as humanely as possible." That's a hell of a difference from how we usually look at conducting warfare. But it led to our approach of targeting the bow or the arrow, but not the human archer. And when we started pulling the thread on this thing, we found out the legal precedent for doing this was already well established. The best case for the Navy is the Aegis weapons system, also followed up very closely by the close-in weapons system, which is what the CRAM system was actually based on. Dick touched base briefly on the Patriot weapons system, and then there was also the Tomahawk anti-ship missile system. If you look at it, it had that capability built into it. And then my favorite, of course, is the Captor sea mine weapon system. I call that the mouse trap that chases the mouse. But where it really drove it home is when you started to look at this was the issue of looking at anti-personnel landmines, which are prohibited, and then anti-tank landmines, which are still allowed. And the difference, of course, is the fact that with the anti-tank landmines, you're going after things. You're not directly targeting people. But there's a fundamental shift in conducting warfare from killing a foe to disarming him. In my dream machine, I tell people in only half inches to march up to a foe, physically remove the rifle from his hands, saw the rifle in half with a diamond-tip saw, hand the two halves back to him, and then tell him to have a nice day. And I was, Dick, you heard Dick talk about the program that OSD Policy Working Group stood up to produce DoD Directive 3000.09, Autonomy in Weapons Systems. That policy was signed out by the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Ashton Carter, in late November 2012. I was asked to see about participating in that. I was the only lab rat from any of the service laboratories asked to participate. That included Air Force, Army, or Navy. And I was very surprised when the directive finally got out and was signed, and the fact that it very closely mirrored ideas that we had published much earlier. 2004, we put out an original paper for the Association of Unmanned Vehicle Systems International at their North American Symposium. And in 2009, I was asked to see about contributing an article for the IEEE Technology and Society magazine. And they were running a special section on lethal robots, and much to my surprise, they chose my article as the lead article in that section. And more recently, I've been requested by the Joint Staff to work with the 2013-2014 Multinational Capabilities Development Campaign. Oh, already? Yeah. Sorry. We're done.
Refreshing. With lawyers, that never works, right? And actually, John asked me to introduce him as not being a lawyer. I forgot that. Naz, you have your 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much to Marcus and to ASIL for organizing this. So I don't have the background of my colleagues on this issue, and I was thinking about sort of what can I bring to this discussion, and my sense is that if I look at the question from the perspective of the broader debate that's gone on over autonomous weapon systems or fully autonomous weapon systems, and particularly this amazingly emotional, passionate debate that has been waged in advocacy circles and in the public sphere between, on the one hand, a call for a full ban on not only development of autonomous weapon systems, but even research on autonomous weapon systems, and on the other hand, a largely technical conversation, and one in which the role of IHL lawyers seems to have been one of saying, well, if we know whether the technology can do what we, the IHL lawyers, can do, then we cannot say that those systems are illegal per se, but then we have to look at how they perform in the battlefield. So I'm just going to make a few very, very general comments about my sense of the debate and where we are and what some of our concerns might be about the way that the debate is being conducted. And I had two images in my mind as I was thinking about this issue. One was if I was thinking about ASIL 2114. And we're sitting here in a room perhaps not so different from this one, hopefully with a better security system at the front door that gets us through more quickly. But next to us in the room, sort of scattered in between the future us in 100 years, are these autonomous weapons, the JAGs of the autonomous weapons systems, right? Themselves autonomous, with their little pink slips, putting in comments, with the sylph-like sort of appearance of many of these weapons, the eyeless, sort of equally fascinating and terrifying features that many of the weapons themselves have. And it seems as though sort of once you enter into this discussion, you quickly get into the theater of imagining these futures where we will sit in sessions with robots and discuss whether or not this or that theory of public international law is applicable and how. The other image was one that was in the Human Rights Watch Killer Robots report, which many of you may have seen and which generated much of the incredibly pitched debate that's gone on since its publication in November 2012. And it's an image from the DMZ in Korea, and it's a test run of a SGR-1 Sentry robot. So there is this black machine with a few parts. It doesn't even bother to have sort of the dead-eyed face of the robot. It's just a big machine. And there is the person on whom, the poor soul on whom this is being tested, is pretending to be a surrendering soldier, sort of standing horrified with his arms up in front of this machine. And it really is a jarring image, perhaps much more so than images of Predator drones flying over Yemen or Pakistan. And I kept coming back to thinking, so why is it that as an IHL lawyer, I'm not reacting to that image the same way that I react to the mushroom cloud of a nuclear weapon, the same way I react to the notion of biological weapons being released in an armed conflict, or even to images of the bombing of Dresden. And I think the reason is that my sense is that as IHL lawyers specifically, we don't look at the question of autonomous weapons systems and genuinely feel that our concern, indeed our horror, is about proportionality, distinction, precautionary measures. I would challenge the notion that those making those arguments actually locate their concern in the technical violation of the legal requirements that we place on individuals and armed actors. Rather, it seems to me that much of this debate is a displaced political debate that is being put on the back of IHL. We are asking international humanitarian law to do the work of politics when we say that international humanitarian law renders these weapons systems per se illegal, when we call upon the CCW to ban research and development. It is not that those views are necessarily incorrect, but my sense is that much as has been the trend in the last 10 years in a great deal of advocacy efforts that increasingly use IHL not as a coherent international legal system, but rather as a toolkit of buzzwords that can be drawn out in order to appeal to our emotions and our fears. Thanks.
Great. So I think we're off to a good start. And we thought at one point that we weren't going to have much of a point of discussion, but I think your last point on the notion of IH amongst us, I hope, certainly amongst the audience, but your last point about the notion that there may not be as many problems within IHL, I'll certainly challenge you on that at some point. But let me start out with sort of more closely the question for both Dick and John to tell us a little more about sort of what autonomous weapon systems really are, and do they differ from robots? And I would certainly think yes. And where we are at this point, and where we could see ourselves going into the future. And I think John will bring to the table a much more technical definition, and then I would assume that Dick can tell us much more about the DoD directive that Mass has mentioned.
Why don't you start, John?
Okay. Throw me into the fodder.
Yeah.
All right, with respect to autonomous weapon systems, what we started out looking at was trying to figure out how we could design these things such that they could figure out for themselves when to pull the trigger. That is simply it, very, very much in a nutshell. But obviously it gets a little more complicated than that. because there's all sorts of these issues, both ethical, legal, philosophical. It's rather interesting. Over the last several years, I have not worked so much with engineers as I have with lawyers and ethicists and others of that sort. And it's been an interesting ride, believe me. But one of the things that I tell people is that whenever I hear the term killer robots, it just sets my teeth on edge, simply because of the fact that these people that are using these terms have never really bothered to look to see what it is we're trying to do. And I said in my opening remarks that what we're attempting to do is to come up with systems that actually can see about disarming a foe as opposed to killing him. And I'm deadly serious about that, no pun intended. But it depends very much on the area that you're looking at, whether you're talking about at sea or in the air or on the ground. Certain environments are tougher to deal with than others. That's just a fact of life. And I think you'll see the autonomous use of weapons come into some of the warfare areas that don't have so much in the way of personnel in the background as you would otherwise. But yeah, we're very much looking forward to developing this. I tell people, I say, you know, it's been literally millennia since man has been beating each other with their clubs and war sticks and whatever. And to come to this point in our technology development, and we're just beginning to scratch the surface right now with respect to the kinds of technologies that needed to be developed to produce autonomous systems with the ability to say when they can and cannot, more importantly, pull the trigger. Just keep that in mind, because there's going to be a lot of money at stake with respect to how this developments go, because that's what we really started looking at to begin with. We did not want to waste the U.S. taxpayers' dollars by starting to go down a wrong path. And that's where we stand right now. Dick?
And Dick, if you can also speak to the point of distinguishing current systems in the definition of autonomy and semi-autonomous weapons, because the directive goes into that, and I think that would be useful for us.
Yeah, in this working group, we looked at a number of autonomous functions that contribute to the development and use of weapons. For example, the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities, or ISR capabilities now, produce huge volumes of data. So autonomous functions that sort that data and focus the human operator on that data are not only appropriate, but make the weapon system much more discriminate and provide useful information to the operator. But we focused really on the definition of autonomous weapons as those weapons that select and engage targets. So it's just the function of lethality, essentially, that we focus the definition of autonomous weapons on. Now, semi-autonomous weapons we defined in the directive as those that perform other functions, but that are autonomous in nature, but don't involve the eventual decision to select and engage those targets. I can give you an example of an autonomous weapon with CRAM. CRAM, there's been talk in the past, including across the hall, about men on the loop or individuals in the loop. A weapon system that has a person making the decision to select and engage the target would be a semi-autonomous weapon, and that would have a man in the loop. Man on the loop, and we've already talked about several systems that exist today that have a man on the loop, would oversee the actions of the machine or the weapon system and have the ability to intervene to stop its selection or engagement of targets, but would not do that normally if the machine is performing as it normally functions. So the CRAM, for example, is an autonomous weapon system. It looks for incoming mortar rounds, rocket rounds, artillery rounds coming in the sky, uses a radar to figure out precisely the location of those incoming rounds, and then engages those rounds with a phalanx system developed by the Navy of very rapid and a high volume of fire to blow up that incoming round in the sky before it lands on the operating base. Now, as I reviewed that, I wasn't really concerned about its autonomous function of selecting and engaging because, as John said, there weren't other things in the sky that might be hit. So there wasn't a discrimination problem. I was worried about the proportionality problem of incidental effects of civilians on the ground being hit by the destroyed mortar round or by the stream of bullets coming from that phalanx system. And the engineers were able to reassure me on both those counts that the destruction of the incoming mortar round is near complete. I mean, it blows up and the explosive energy dissipates in the air and it falls down as bits of metal falling from the sky. And in the same way, the rounds from the phalanx system self-destruct at maximum range and then again fall much like dust to the floor and don't have the same collateral effects as an incoming mortar round or an anti-aircraft round that in prior wars has come down and destroyed civilian population.
So let me push you a little bit on that, right? So those systems sound, since we have to have some debate up here, right? Let me push you a little bit, because those systems sound really sort of, people could nod their heads, right, and say, yeah, that sounds right. To what extent do we, and Naz mentioned this, right, so the Human Rights Watch report has this, I forget the name of the system, SGR1 or whatever, pick your poison. What about situations where there's which are more tricky, right, where there's more engagement with others around, right, so the incoming rocket doesn't really bother me as much as the battle space of today, which is much more complicated and involves civilians, involves combatants, involves houses potentially, involves places of worship, and a whole range of other elements, right? And trying to make distinction, which we'll get to in a second, and proportionality there strikes me as much more tricky. Right. So, can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, it definitely is more tricky, and what we did with the directive and the policy review of this issue is to establish parameters for adoption of that capability. For example, the DoD Directive has been mischaracterized as a ban on autonomous weapons. It isn't a ban on autonomous weapons. What it is it establishes standards for review of autonomous weapons and an approach that requires verification and validation, extensive verification and validation by the engineers to make sure that it'll do what we say it will do, to make sure that the human being that is really deciding to engage, who's programming the weapon system or operating the weapon system, can be held responsible for that conduct. And it requires very high levels of review and 2 series of reviews. During the research and development process or science and technology phase of weapons development, it has to go through a review all the way up to the Undersecretary of Defense for policy level, and that includes a legal review as part of that. And then the second review, once the research and development has been completed and it's going to be acquired as a weapon system, it has to go through the same process and get very high level of approval. Now, why is that? That's so that appropriate levels of human judgment are applied to this technology. What does that mean? I can't explain what appropriate levels of human judgment are for the policymakers, but I can explain for the lawyers that have to review it what that is. And the legal standards we apply are the standard IHL standards that we've been referring to here, which is proportionality, distinction, whether or not it is in its nature an indiscriminate weapon. And that would address your question, Marcus.
Yeah, there's another piece to this as well. What we've just been talking about here really has to do with the acquisition end of this thing. And what you have to design into it up front. There's another piece of this, and that's how it actually gets used in the field. Okay, and obviously today's soldier is inundated with lots and lots of information, commands, orders, and things of this nature, rules of engagement, whatever. And he takes all this on board and he processes it, and then he behaves accordingly unless something really gets screwed up. But with the machine, we've got another situation here, okay, and the fact that you've still got to be able to take that same sort of information and put it in the machine's got to be able to behave appropriately. One of the things that we've realized early on is that we will have to come up with a tactical decision aid to see about going hand in glove with the commander for these things, such that once he decides what his engagement policy is going to be based on all these constraints and stuffs it down into the machine, but before he turns that machine loose, they're going to have to see about doing a tactical war game on this stuff to make sure the policies actually work the way he thought they were going to. And if it doesn't, he's got to come back and see about tweaking it and then rerun that war game until it actually starts working the way he thought it was going to in the first place.
John, let me follow up before we get to the more lawyerly side, right? So my impression so far has been that there are at least two different types of technologies we're looking at. Number one is sort of the mechanical technologies of optics and whatever other sensors may be out there, right? In order to figure out, is this a human being that is a combatant, or is this, right? So that, but then there's another element to it which is much more software and code-based, right? Which is, how do we make the determinations about distinction and proportionality, right? Can you speak a little bit to the point or where you think we are in that process?
We're just beginning to scratch the surface on that one. But matter of fact, I had a phone call with the Navy JAG the day before yesterday, specifically to start talking about that issue. And it's going to be a difficult one, but I don't see it as being insurmountable.
Okay.
Yeah, I can't remember his first name, but Arkin.
Ron?
Ron Arkin has put a lot of effort into this, and I saw him speak at a conference recently, and his belief is that the artificial intelligence capability of, and Marcus is really talking, I think, about the decision-making process, not the sorting of information, but the selection and engagement process. We're a long way away from having a machine or a robot program to be able to make that decision. When I talk to research and development folks at Picatinny, for example, the equivalent of Dahlgren except in New Jersey for the Army, I tell them I'm from Missouri. So those of you that are from the United States know that if you say you're from Missouri, you're from the show me state. And that's what, under an Article 36 of Additional Protocol 1 review of weapons systems, we really expect the developer to show us that they're capable of making that proportionality and distinction determination. I don't think they're capable anytime soon, and neither do the people I talk to in the research and development world. But the scientists that are thinking long-term in development of artificial intelligence, and I think Yoram just said he thinks it's 15 to 25 or 30 years away. I think that's an accurate restatement of even what Arkin would say about that capability. But Yoram also said it means it's the next generation who's going to decide that. I think that's true, but there are currently autonomous capabilities that we have to deal with in this context. So Landmines are governed by a different legal regime. We have defensive autonomous capabilities that operate in an environment where there is no distinction required. Mm-hmm. So those systems we've carved out of our directive because we think that autonomy offers right now some military advantage that precludes incorrect decisions or limits them to a very small number.
Great. Great because it will keep me busy for the next 25 years because I still consider myself to be the next generation.
Not me.
Thanks. So let's talk about things for the lawyers a little bit, right? Distinction, proportionality, and John, we will tie you into that, right? Because so my own take on this one was. So distinction proportionality, I don't think we have to describe it very much here, but that at least parts of distinction seem to me a much more quantitative or amenable to quantitative analysis versus proportionality, which, and that may be very much informed by myself being European, sounds much more qualitative, right? And to what extent, and when I talk to technology people, the idea is we throw a lot of data at it. Right, and I say that's perfectly fine for a car that's autonomously operated as the famous Google car, and we can equip sort of all of our streets with sensors, and they can all talk with one another. But the battlefield sounds very different to me, right? And just infrastructurally will probably not work the same way. So, Naz, maybe I can turn to you first. What are your thoughts about distinction, proportionality, how we can integrate either one? Can we integrate, can we not, into a system that is supposed to function autonomously for many, many reasons?
So I want to be very careful, and I want to urge all of us in the room who are not experts in robotics and technology to be very careful. I don't know. Right? I mean, I don't know whether at some point in the future, whether in our generation or another one, there could be a technology that could do a better job than a human being at the complex, indeed virtually impossible task of determining when there is excessive harm in relation to anticipated military advantage. Mm-hmm. So I think that's really important, number one, to keep in mind. There may be people who have answers to those questions. I would posit they are not public international lawyers, by and large. Second, I think, like John, for example, and I think there is a risk of overreach there, right? That we go beyond the appropriate
that our worries are too big, you think?
No, that the worries may not even be big enough, okay, but that there are people who should be having that discussion in a particular language, and it may not be IHL that should be the dominant language for that discussion. But of course there are IHL questions, and I think, I don't know that I would draw the line between sort of distinction being quantitative and proportionality being qualitative. I think I would say the question is it an essentially human function, mm-hmm, right? Is there something about, we always talk about proportionality, and then there's that sort of mystery aspect of it, right? That there is no algorithm, there is no morbid calculus that we can point to and say, for all armed conflicts, this is the math, right? But it does not seem to me, and what I have come to understand about this technology and its development, that we are talking about removing the human element or the human judgment in the creation of the systems, mm-hmm, and in the way that they seek to make decisions. So I'm still not convinced that the question of whether the weapon systems ought to exist at all is actually an IHL question.
Okay. Dick, you want to chime in? Because
I'd like to add a little bit of controversy to this panel by talking about a distinction and a notion that John presented earlier, and that is the notion that we could program a weapon system to just focus on the AK-47 in the guy's hand and take that out. And I've challenged John on this in other locations because I think that provides us the most complex distinction problem. And in the current environment where asymmetric tactics are employed, or where, for example, in Afghanistan, just about every other male carries an AK-47, whether they intend to use it against you or not, it presents the greatest distinction problem for man and machine. Mm-hmm. So I really challenge the notion that we'll be able to, now anyway, just target a weapon in that circumstance. But there are in existence already technologies that perform the same distinction function. For example, we have a version of cluster munitions, I guess you could call them, that disperse over a basket, over a territorial area, and then negotiate their way to a tank that's below it, and choose that tank as opposed to the civilian vehicle, or a bus full of nuns is the worst distinction problem, of course. They make that distinction between a civilian object and a military objective required. Now, that is a selection of targets. In our parlance, in my view, that machine, that little brilliant pebble, has not decided to engage that target, because there's really three areas that distinction come in. First is the creation of the capability and the programming, but second is in the employment. And we still expect military commanders employing a system with autonomous functions to engage in the decision-making process that's required by IHL. And John made that point, that's important. And then the third location where some decision-making or selection and engagement is made is in the deployment of the system. So we also carved out of our directive those systems where an operator would say, I see a bunch of targets in that grid square, so I'm going to launch a munition that will engage those military objectives, because that operator is that F-16 pilot or that artillery unit is selecting and engaging those targets himself. It's not the machine who is making that distinction and proportionality determination.
And one of the things I'll add to this business, when you talk about target signatures, okay? I ran into this first back in the early 90s when I was working the Navy's Tactical Ballistic Missile Defense Program, and trying to figure out if what was coming in was actually something we had to worry about or not. And it turns out that the signature for a threat that you get is very highly aspect angle dependent. So when you start looking for something and trying to figure out, what it is you're looking at, you're talking about some really sizable databases that you have to put together with target signatures. Now, if you're out there looking for a face in a crowd, that's one face out of a potential target population of how many billions on the surface of the Earth. You're talking about a really huge database for that. Whereas if you're going after an AK-47, one AK-47 looks pretty much like any other AK-47, and you reduced your target identification problem enormously just by doing that. And what you try to do is to look for technologies that get away as much as possible from that aspect angle dependency, because that's what really makes you be able to work efficiently.
And I think I share that, right? So, and I'm glad, Dick, you mentioned this distinction between distinction, right? Between the easier ones versus the harder ones, right? That at that point, distinction no longer is quantitative, right? It's highly qualitative assessments, right? Whether the person who, for cultural reasons, may wear a kirpan, which I put into one of my articles, that's a dagger, essentially, right? Does this for cultural reasons, or really to arm himself, or in that case, or the person goes out hunting and legitimately carries a rifle, right? And that becomes a much more tricky business. Can we talk about proportionality? Because that strikes me as even more complicated, right? And to what extent do we think technology can actually do that? So my position for now, for the time being, is no technologist has yet shown a really convincing way of doing proportionality, right? And John and I were at a conference together where we've had technologists try to come up to that, but it always comes back down to data, right? And the problem that you just mentioned, I think, multiplies almost when we talk about proportionality, right? Not only would you have to have a database, but you have to have that database, the data points within the database relational to one another and have some kind of overarching rule that says, in this event, this is how it works, right? And I talked to those technologists for hours at that conference, and still was.
Noticed.
Yes, we noticed, right? But where do we stand on this, right? To what extent can we replicate, from a technology standpoint, considerations of proportionality, which again some people really dislike because it's too abstract and yada yada yada. But to what extent is there a way to get there? From a technological point.
Like I said, I was very much encouraged by the conversation I had with the Navy JAG the other day with respect to this, and I think that we can do it. Now, like I said earlier, is that it's been millennia since we started conducting war on each other, and it's taken us that long to come to the current state of technology that we have today. We're just barely scratching the surface on this right now. Mm-hmm. And I suspect long after we're all gone and buried from this panel that people will still be trying to develop the technologies to go into this. So it's not a done deal, but I think I can see a light.
Okay. Dick, do you want to jump in and then ask?
Yeah, the predictive nature of this discussion and the attempt to ban autonomous weapons really concerns me because, I mean, I think there are just incredible potential benefits to the imposition of legal standards by having a precise determination of distinction and proportionality. But it's such a complex problem that I really don't envy John's work and Arkin and others in developing it, and that's because of the objective and subjective nature of these legal standards. And we talked a lot in the last hour about proportionality, but I want to point out that the what I term as subjective pieces of proportionality. What's excessive with respect to the concrete and direct military advantage gained? Okay, that's in the mind of a commander, as Jorm said, that's something that they can put their arms around and understand. But in the mind of a robot, I'm not sure. I don't think so at all. And we also have to consider precautions in the attack. Look at all the language of the law that's so subjective in precautions of the attack. Use constant care versus conduct that's imperatively demanded by the necessities of war. You have to do everything feasible to address the collateral damage problem in precautions in the attack. So the choice of means is going to be a sometimes very subjective judgment. You have to refrain from or cancel disproportionate attacks. So we have to build into this algorithm a last clear chance rule to end the attack, so that when the facts change, we don't conduct a disproportionate attack. Do warning if feasible. Choice of targets is based on a similar military advantage. Again, this is a very subjective weighing of military benefits that a commander understands, but I don't think we're even close to replicating the mind of the commander in the technology.
And different commanders may also have different versions of responsibility in their mind, right? And
sure, but it's the reasonable commander in the circumstances at the time that we judge him on, and then if it's wanton and willful misconduct, we prosecute him for it.
Sure, but look, I'm also a comparativist, right? And as a comparativist, I'm always struck by how differently, outside of the military context, proportionality gets defined by different courts and different legal systems. It'll be interesting to see which version of proportionality finds its way at some point into this. And for some reason, we do have that, right, in AP1, and for good reasons probably. But it'll be an interesting debate to coalesce that, right? Yeah.
Yeah, the only thing I would say here is I think we need to be honest about what the law currently says. Mm-hmm. And the reality is that I think that the expectation and understanding of the public as to the term proportionality, as it is often used in political debates, is very different from what the law will allow, as long as the correct measures have been taken by armed actors. And as long as, of course, civilian distinction has been satisfied and the terms of proportionality have been satisfied. So I just think it's important that in this debate, we don't pretend that AP1 or any of the customary law standards of proportionality, as currently in the law, do more than they really do. Right now, a lawyer, a human lawyer, I don't know what's in the mind of a robot, right? Much like I don't know what's in the mind of a Martian. Maybe it's better than my mind, maybe not, I don't know. But currently, while of course commanders make different judgments, while of course JAGs give different types of advice, we do know that proportionality is not the avoidance of all death of civilians, which sometimes in the public debate on this issue, it sounds to me as though we are pretending that the law is doing something vis-a-vis humans that it is currently not doing.
Okay.
Just to emphasize that point a little bit, any weapons developer worth his salt is going to be able to tell you with a pretty good degree of accuracy how much damage a particular weapon that he has designed is capable of doing. And from that standpoint, you can use that information and go back in, and it's going to be a statistical case that you come up with as to how much collateral damage you can expect, and given the population that you have around there, again, it's going to be a statistical estimate as to whether or not you're going to suffer any kind of human casualties out of that, or injuries, or what. That's half of the proportionality issue. The other half, of course, is establishing military worth of the target, and that was most of what took up my conversation with the JAG the other day. Was talking to him on that aspect, was the military worth side. And like I said, it's a complex issue, but I think that there is a path forward there. And all I have to say is send money.
So I would throw in one more complicating factor, but then we have to move on, right? And then putting those two factors into relation with one another. Right, and I think that last step probably adds a level of complexity that remains to be seen. And I was very heartened to hear Yoram Dinstein say in the previous panel that proportionality is not. There's no algorithm for that, right? And maybe there will be an algorithm for that. I'm open to that, but at this point, I think I sense a lot of caution even on this panel. So let's shift gears a little bit to individual and criminal responsibility, and I have to make this point just briefly. I think the DoD Directive is sort of brilliant in a way that it's starting and has already started to shape the debate, right? Now everyone seems to want to refer to it, and so I'll probably have to turn it over to Dick to tell us a little bit about what the directive says. In a forthcoming piece on this in the Vanderbilt Journal of Transnational Law, I write about something that I call the potential system of organized irresponsibility, but everyone always assures me that of course never happens. So what about the lines of responsibility, right? Criminal responsibility, command responsibility. Who will be responsible should something go wrong, right? I mean, there's a long line of people involved in this, and it seems to me at least a little more complex than existing systems that we have.
Well, of course, I take issue with the organized irresponsibility
comment. Of course,
comment.
I have to say something.
I would say it's quite the opposite. It's a demonstration of state responsibility to a degree that is unprecedented, and it's unfortunate because, as John mentioned, the directive came out almost simultaneously with the killer robot nonsense from Human Rights Watch. So I just invite you to read it, first of all, and judge for yourself whether or not that's responsible governmental action. And I would say it certainly is. But it's really doing one thing, and that is establishing state responsibility for the development of autonomous weapons systems, and doing that in the most responsible manner we think can be done. So it's not banning autonomous weapons, but it is saying if we are going to employ autonomous weapons, we're going to do this that requires a high level of adult supervision in order to first adopt the weapon system in the acquisition process. Most of my clients work at Picatinny Arsenal, as I say. They respond to a work statement developed from the field or from a long-term acquisition need of the military. And they have an acquisition, a program manager that decides to acquire that system based on a system of regulations. So what we've done is we've taken something that's a decision made at maybe the one-star general level within the military for acquisition and bumped that all the way up to the highest level of civilian leadership within Department of Defense. That by itself is a very responsible act as a state. Now, as to individual criminal responsibility, the directive doesn't change that. It doesn't change the obligation of the commander that employs the weapon system to be sure that it will be employed in a discriminate manner and to do the proportionality analysis when they employ it. Or it requires the commander to understand the capability of that system when they employ it. So there's a slightly different view of that responsibility, but it's still the command responsibility, the person that employs the weapon system that is individually responsible for it.
And you've got some responsibilities that go in even before that. They really weren't touched too much in the directive, but we've looked at these things for a long time now, not just autonomous systems, but other weapon systems as well. And during the development, we have people that are supposed to see about signing off on things. It's what they call a technical direction agent, okay? A technical direction agent is somebody who is very senior and is knowledgeable in these fields. And so they have a responsibility when they sign off to make sure that they think it's going to do what it says it's supposed to do. But then beyond that, before they ever make it out to the field, you've got to see about taking it through live fire test and evaluation. The Navy is called the Operational Test and Evaluation Force, OPTEV 4. The Army's got something similar, so does the Air Force. But they have got to see about wringing these things out through their own testing system to make sure that the thing is acceptable for use on the battlefield before it ever gets in the hands of a commander.
And I would never say that. So to me, the state responsibility issue is not as big of a problem, right? I've yet to be convinced that there is a real fundamental challenge here. But the individual responsibility, I would like to prod you a little bit about that, right? So who do we have in this line? We have the programmer potentially. If I'm a sort of put my litigator hat on, which I've never wore and never have, but I'll just pretend I have one. So I have the programmer in some ways, then I have you, who conducted the Article 36 testing, right? Then I have the commander, the person who decided above you, because you'll say that's above my pay grade, that said we want to actually employ this system as a general matter into our military arsenal. And then I have the commander in the field, and then I have probably the person who actually sends it up, right? And since this is a highly complex system, and the more complex systems get, the less people further down the chain may know how that system actually reacts, right? And in this case, we program into an autonomous system an algorithm, right? It's not just the weight of the artillery shell that has to conform to certain specifications, but here we have a much more abstract code that reacts to inputs, but also is supposed to do all this autonomously, right? To what extent can you assure that person at the lower ends of that food chain to know what they're doing and that the system is actually doing it correctly, right? And realize that I'm not trying to be a firebrand, I'm just trying to get you to.
That's one of the reasons why I was talking earlier about using a tactical decision aid. Okay? Because these things are getting so complex, that's the only way you're going to be able to tell whether or not these things are actually doing what they're supposed to do. Basically, you build a system that will war game any particular setup that you've got to make sure it is behaving the way you want it to.
But I get questions every week from somebody in the field that says, can I get a copy of the weapons review for this system? And they're saying, I want to make sure that what we have out there is an approved weapon system under the AP1 requirements, but also a DoD directive that was developed in 1974 before AP1 was written. But we tell people in the field, if it's been acquired under the acquisition system of Department of Defense, then you can trust that it'll do what we tell you it will do. Okay, so the system that we developed under the DoD directive is intended to certify that for the operator. But then the operator, still in the employment, has to connect the capability of the system with the threat or the target that it's being used against, and make the decision to use that system to select and engage targets for that commander. So there's still a direct responsibility to employ the legal standard in use, because any system can be used unlawfully. I can certify an M16 that it's not inherently indiscriminate weapon system, because we don't bend all the barrels so that the bullet goes in the wrong direction. We build it so that it'll hit what we aim at. But then if the soldier takes it and uses it to murder a bunch of civilians, he's responsible for that. Or if the commander tells him to do that, the commander's responsible for that.
All right, so we have I want to get the audience involved fairly quickly, so I want to shift and get back to something that Nas said about the sort of ethical and policy considerations. And you said sort of the allegations that these things are illegal are proxies for other concerns, right? And so I want to get to that debate. But there are potentially real concerns, right? And so someone will sort of loop into things that certain people have said, that, well, we shouldn't be too concerned about them. As a matter of fact, we should be employing them and have a duty to employ them if we find that they are actually better than humans, right? And the baseline for that seems to be a Surgeon General report of 2006 or 2009 that said 10% of Marines and Army soldiers have admitted to either having committed or having been witness to the commission of what could be classified as war crimes. And if we're better than that, then we have a duty to employ autonomous weapon systems. I'm a Kantian in that way. I have my problems with that logic, right? But let's sort of just to tee it up. What about the policy and ethical considerations, Nas?
So yes, I think there are many potential policy and ethical considerations, and I think that it's a serious. I think it's often mocked by those involved in this debate, but it seems to me that the possibility that this could actually be better for civilians in certain cases as to certain systems is one that has to be taken seriously. You raised the Google cars, and there was one of the scientists who was working on these self-driving cars or autonomous cars said that they are expecting that they will have to reach something that I'm simply quoting this, I have no idea what this means, but the 6 sigma level, that there would be 3 defects per million. Basically, that if you're going to produce and sell self-driving cars, they have to be much, much, much better than regular cars, human-driven cars, in order to be acceptable to the public, in order for the public to overcome the bizarreness of the car driving down the highway with no one in the driver's seat. I don't know what it means that Dick's from Missouri. I'm from California, where they seem to be very comfortable with this idea, so I don't know what that says about Californians. But, and interestingly, in that debate, it has not been, traffic lawyers haven't been the main players in that debate. It's been in the public sphere, right? There's been a discussion about whether mayors and local council members and state legislators should take action to regulate these things before they're on the roads and come up with ways of dealing with this before it happens. So my sense is that if we really talk about what concerns us, if we really talk about what bothers us, which seems to me to not actually be what we are saying it is that bothers us, then we would be having a very different conversation, and potentially we would be having a conversation that also calls into question much of the currently applicable law. So for example, on the accountability question, you read about the supposed accountability gap for killer robots, which to me the phrase is a lot like enhanced interrogation, right? Or elongated imminence, right? It's loose logic, right? So fine, killer robots. But the accountability gap seems to have as a fiction behind it that every day we have prosecutions for the violation of the principle of proportionality. It's actually very difficult to hold someone accountable for violating the principle of proportionality in the battlefield. So all I want to say is I think that a more honest discussion of the concerns and perhaps locating those concerns outside of IHL would drive a public debate about whether or not democratic publics want to accept these weapons and what standards lawmakers and the public wish to put on them.
Right, I think you can draw sort of a parallel, and I've certainly drawn it, to the notion of, and I know this is somewhat controversial, so that's done on purpose, to say that there is a parallel for politicians. It sort of seems like a good thing to have, right? You don't bring coffins back and soldiers in coffins back, and that sort of reminds me of the debate of private military contractors in some ways, right? Where you decrease the political costs for going or engaging in war, and I know that there are people who vociferously disagree with that. But is there something to this? Has there been a debate, Dick Jackson, about this question at all that you're familiar with, or is this something where you say that I leave that to the political side completely?
Well, there's certainly a current ongoing debate on the ethical and political implications. Of course, I'm not an expert on that. Professor Lubon, maybe from Georgetown, could answer these questions better than I can. But I could give you a couple of examples of the arguments made. One is it's not chivalrous to use autonomous weapons. Another is that it's just wrong to let a robot decide who lives or dies. The chivalry or fighting from afar argument is also made with respect to drones or remotely piloted aircraft or vehicles, as we call them. And the extension of warfare to over-the-horizon capabilities has been inexorable for a long time. So I think that argument is really a shibboleth. But and the chivalry argument is also kind of silly too, because again, we're using artillery rounds from 22 kilometers away or 50 kilometers away. You know, and there's no chivalry involved in that. You're not facing your individual. But ethically, I guess the question that hits me most is it's wrong to have humans make a decision to kill. Now, I would respond by that in saying that I don't think that now, in the current capabilities and in the near future, it will be the human making, the machine making the decision to kill. That the human is either in the loop or on the loop or decides to launch the capability that will select and engage targets. So it's not the human isn't out of the decision-making loop anywhere in the near future. But someday, when artificial intelligence is available, and maybe that'll be a real ethical problem that we have to engage with.
I think there's a human cost avoidance factor to this as well. Again, this comes from the personal side. My oldest son is a major in the U.S. Army. He came out of college, went straight into Iraq. He did 2 combat tours in Iraq, and he just finished up his 5th combat tour in Afghanistan. I look at it and I say, you know, for his entire adult life, the only thing he has known is war. I can't say that he doesn't have PTSD, but I can't say he does either. But, you know, it's something like that you got to factor into whether or not you're going to use something like this as well.
All right. Last point before we open it up to the audience. I think, and Naz brought this up, so I want to give you the floor on this. This sort of discourse over autonomous weapon systems that is so disparate between, say, the human rights community and the international humanitarian law community, which somewhat strikes me as bizarre in many ways, right? And I think we've seen, for better or worse, one side of that discourse here, right, which I would locate very much in the IHL, in what you would call the IHL camp. But it seems to always be better to talk with one another, right? But why do we have this sharp distinction seemingly over this? And to some extent, I think we saw this in the drone debate also, foreshadowed certainly, but probably even more striking here. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so I was, when we had been discussing the panel in advance, I was struck by the fact, and for those who have sort of followed the discussion and debate between human rights and IHL, and then the discussion of to what extent the two apply together or simultaneously or et cetera, this particular debate seems really different to me. One, just in sort of my conversations with colleagues before this panel, when I would speak to JAGs or those on the sort of military side of thinking about IHL, they characterize the Killer Robots report and the campaign much the way Dick did earlier. Nonsense, embarrassing, ridiculous, which are not terms that are generally used to characterize reports that talk about IHL from Human Rights Watch. In fact, there's often a very rich substantive debate that goes on when those reports come out looking either at bomb damage assessments or looking at particular campaigns. Not in this case. It wasn't a let's get into the specifics, but rather this reaction of the whole thing is ridiculous. And on the human rights side, my sense in talking to colleagues in the human rights community was that the Killer Robots report and the campaign were seen as groundbreaking, as a landmark approach to an issue, and as really opening up an international conversation on this, culminating in the discussion at the CCW and the decision taken by consensus for a longer evaluation of the question, a decision by the European, a non-binding decision as I understand it, by the European Parliament that does call for a ban on R&D and on the development of these weapons. And I think it's interesting that in this area you have such a different perception of what even the questions are, much less how these dilemmas ought to be dealt with. And I think if you juxtapose that with the drone debate, the human rights community has handled it very differently. So there has not been, to my knowledge, other than really groups on sort of more involved in the political left as opposed to sort of the human rights elite. In the drones debate, it hasn't been ban all weaponized drones and make them illegal. It's been let's talk about the application of IHL and human rights law in specific attacks. Which it's an interesting sort of choice in advocacy tactics, and we'll see what bears a better result. And
do you think that's a lesson learned from that particular debate in which maybe the human rights community thought, well, we didn't really have a voice in the, or sort of the concerns weren't really heard as much? And I'm not saying that may be true, but is that maybe lesson learned, right?
Right, I don't know. I think that's a really interesting question, right? That which is the lesson learned? Is it that engagement and getting your hands dirty gets you more influence in how the weapon system is used? Or is it that standing on the outside and saying it's per se illegal drives the discussion that you actually want?
Sure. Right. And part of the frustration may also have been that only a portion of the drone attacks were carried out by the military versus intelligence services. I think that, and everything that goes along with that, right? Dick, any last words before, or should I
Well,
open?
yeah, I think it's similar to the debate on the campaign to ban landmines and cluster munitions. It's a choice of something that represents an evil in a way that has a visceral response in the public and in the human rights community. But it's an advocacy approach that doesn't really address the harm that's intended to be prevented from an IHL perspective. Okay, so with anti-personnel landmines, for example, there's amended Protocol 2 of the CCW that tries to cabin the allegedly indiscriminate effects of the landmines so that they can be used as a lawful military weapon. But yet we decide to ban it, that capability. I saw the same debate happen as CCW tried to engage the cluster munitions discussion. It was, okay, if we create self-destruct capability or they're no longer explosive remnants of war on the battlefield, then what's the indiscriminate use problem? So I think it's a good thing, really, that this is being discussed in CCW rather than some parallel approach that just attacks a shibboleth rather than addresses the real legal issues and moral and ethical issues that are involved in this capability.
And just as a sort of final word, and please feel free to head towards the microphones if you want to raise any questions. The problem that strikes me as being different as opposed to, say, landmines or cluster munitions or laser blinding weapons is that in this case you actually have technologies that are very much dual-use technologies, right? So we at Miami had the We Robot conference this last week, and there are very similar issues that are going to be debated, right? The autonomous self-driving car has, in some ways, similar considerations that you have to program into that that machine that are not so far off, right, from a weaponized version thereof. All right, so I see at least one person on this side, and feel free to ask your questions, and maybe introduce yourself by just saying your name.
Hi, my name's Karina Roselli. I'm a student at Vermont Law School, but by trade I'm actually an Army aviator. So my question has to do with distinction, and this may be better suited for drones for my field, but in general, for autonomous weaponry, I think the distinction conversation always goes back to the obvious concerns about removing human judgment from the equation and the process of target acquisition. And so that always dominates the conversation. But on the flip side of that, and from my personal concerns and experience, there's also a mitigation of human error. And there's a tremendous amount of good that can come from that. And it seems relatively absent from the conversation, and I wondered if you could speak as to your opinion on that and why you think it's absent from the conversation. Thank you.
I think you're dead on with your comments there. They always talk about the fog of war, okay, and mistakes get made in those particular cases. For something like this, it gives you the opportunity to wring these systems out in advance of you ever having to take them into a battle to make sure that they're going to do what you think they're supposed to do. So from that standpoint, like I said, yeah, I think you're exactly right. A lot of good can come out of these things.
And I think Marcus's question before went to this point. We do make mistakes in war, and there is intentional misconduct. The Bales case is the best example from the U.S. recently, and those people are prosecuted. So to the extent we can take error out of warfare, I think there are definitely going to be beneficial effects from autonomous weapons.
Let me say something more against that, right? And I may not hold that view. I may hold that view. I don't know, right? Don't we want certain things to happen in war in some ways to educate us that war is, and that's certainly an opinion that I do hold, that war is inherently not a good thing, right? So war is an ultima ratio function. You want to minimize war as much as possible, right? And is there something, that sounds really good, right? And we're all for that, but is there a larger learning curve from the very fact that certain crimes have been committed in the conduct of war, right? Or is there not, right? And at least something to think about, right? Maybe we'll get to that.
Exercise your vote carefully.
Yeah. Yes. We'll go to this side and then we'll switch back and forth.
Thank you. My name is Kuba Machag. I'm from the University of Exeter. I will not repeat my question from the previous panel. I think you answered very well the question related to principle of proportionality. But I'd like to push you a little bit on the notions of responsibility. And you talked about criminal responsibility, but perhaps we could also elaborate on the civil side of liability that is involved in these questions. And Article 91 of the first additional protocol speaks of the responsibility of the parties for all acts of persons forming the part of their armed forces. So I think this raises two interesting questions. Number one, does this extend to acts of the autonomous systems, this notion of responsibility? And I have a hunch from the previous discussion that most of the members of the panel would say yes to that question. And the second one is, does that, if we answer the first question in affirmative, does that mean that the standard is lowered compared to the standard of criminal responsibility, where we typically require intent and knowledge? So is it lowered to a standard that would also include negligence on the part of the programmer and other people involved in the chain in development and deployment of these weapons? And if so, are we then importing into IHL something akin to product liability? Thank you.
I think I'll turn that to Dick, if
Yeah,
you want, because I mean, I have my thoughts on it. But.
I take issue with your underlying assumption that civil liability somehow works its way into IHL. That notion is not accepted really by any court, to my knowledge. And so it really focuses on, or we should focus on, criminal responsibility of the operator, and in whether or not that criminal responsibility somehow works its way backwards in the chain. And I think getting to the criminal responsibility level, given the approach that we're taking in the directive of verification and validation of high levels of approval, I think that's highly unlikely. It's really the person that employs that weapon system that will be held to that international criminal war crimes level of responsibility.
But would you maybe, and maybe I can take that a little further, right? Wouldn't we say that civil liability sounds a lot like state responsibility, though, in that way, right? So if I'm trying to reinterpret your question, but if you want to...
Yes, and if we can, I mean, if I may develop on it, Article 91 speaks of the duty to compensate if the case so requires. So there indeed is this standard incorporated in rules of IHL. Now, of course, Additional Protocol 1 has not been ratified by all the countries in the world.
Well, no. I think is the short answer to that question. It's an agreement between states, and so state compensation, as the Hague rules deal with, are definitely at issue at the end of an armed conflict. But compensation of victims, as another panel talked about here, is not an obligation of IHL. But there are ex gratia approaches taken by many militaries, including my own, where we have compensated as an ex gratia, not a legal obligation, victims of armed conflict, and that's partly an attempt to ameliorate the political consequences of armed conflict.
Can I just make one comment? I think it also very much depends on who is the public that we are talking about, right? So if Americans or Brits or Israelis or the other countries that appear to be closer to this technology imagine that armed robot police are going to conduct traffic stops, and that you're sitting in the car with your children and the robot with the gun is going to come and talk to you, that may activate very different concerns about liability, product liability, the realm of possible accountability in a domestic legal context, than if that same public is thinking about Afghans, some vaguely very far away, that are going to be affected by what may be a very efficient and ethically robust system that is going to deal with those issues that we don't see very closely. So I think part of this depends on what does it look like when these systems become real? Do we experience them in a sort of day-to-day sense, or is it only in the realm of sort of weapons being used in far-off places?
I think that's an excellent point, actually. Just this notion of how close proximity do we have to have in order to be concerned about something, right? And I think we see this, frankly, with engagement in armed conflict more generally speaking, right? We've sort of limited it to a smaller extent, and I'm glad that John, you mentioned this, right? It becomes personal at some point, but I certainly think the debate in this country hasn't been nearly as much to that level that it is personal, right? I don't feel the country, and I say this as a non-citizen, is nearly as invested in the conflict over the last 5-10 years as maybe it should have been, right? I think I see Dan Saxon on this side. Lights are blinding, but.
Thank you for a great discussion. I'm Dan Saxon. I teach international law at Leiden University in Holland. The panel did not talk about the subjects of time or speed. And by that I mean, to me, from my research on this subject, it seems pretty clear that from a military advantage standpoint, one of the benefits as this technology develops will be the ability to make warfighting decisions and engage targets much more quickly. And so, Dick, I think my question is going to be directed to you because you talked about the appropriate level of human judgment standard in Directive 3000.09 and how that really refers to the common standards of IHL, which I can understand. However, was there any debate when the directive was being developed about a particular danger that as the speed of these new systems and as the speed of the technology develops, might there be then, because of the military advantage that will then result, might there be increasing pressure to reduce the levels of human supervision on these systems to obtain the highest amounts of military advantage?
Yeah, that's a great question because it really was a huge focus of our working group, which had scientists like John on it, acquisition specialists, et cetera. And what we looked at is errors made in the past in order to address that issue. And one of the issues we dealt with was machine bias or over reliance on the machine's decision-making capability. And it was important to keep that in mind, that training of the operator to exercise that appropriate level of human judgment was really important in these systems. And so, for example, the tornado shoot-downs and the Aegis analysis from the Vincennes, we really focused on that issue, and that's the reason behind much of the validation and verification approach. Now, those guidelines, I think, have been developed more broadly, and to focus on that issue to make sure that we don't have individuals relying too much on that decision-making capability of the machine.
John, let me follow up on that because I think this is a really, really good point. We will get to you, Mary Ellen. This notion of scenario fulfillment, right, is much more of a psychological issue, and to what extent can you build this into a system, right? Because I think that's incredibly important. So for those who are not familiar with the Vincennes incident, the system seemed to say, yes, you seem to have contradictory information, let's put it this way. But because, and this is for the soccer fans among you, people are loath to red card functioning systems, right, and hit the kill switch all too often. To what extent can one build this into a system in a way that seems that would make those tragic mistakes, right, not much less frequent, but less frequent, right? Or minimize the risk, because I think that's a real concern, because on the psychological side, most human beings, Milgram experiment, whatever you want to bring up, are unwilling, if a certain amount of authority seems to be present, to actually interrupt, right? So this goes much less into the legal side, but also to what extent can those psychological elements be built into systems? Is there any debate that in the engineering side so far on this?
Well, from my understanding of the Vincennes accident, it was not in the auto special mode, so it was kind of a moot argument, really.
Mm-hmm. But as a general matter, I would think that that's something that, Dick, have you debated this in so far at all? But you seem to be nodding when I said this, so.
Well, no, I mean, I think it's a good point, and it's something that we looked at in the development of the policy, but I don't really feel technically capable of addressing the question.
Okay.
My name is Mary Ellen O'Connell. I'm a professor of law at the University of Notre Dame, and I work on resort to war, conduct of war, weapons systems, and found the conversation very interesting. I've done a lot more work in recent years on drones and autonomous weapon systems. The very final conversation before you open to the floor for discussion between Marcus and Naz about drones versus fully autonomous robotic systems was very interesting to me about, and this point that one weapon system seems to be going in a different trajectory, much more interest in banning versus drone technology or unmanned. And I think there's an important additional reason to the ones that you suggested that should be part of this conversation, and that's that the movement to ban autonomous weapons, and it goes by the term, ban killer robots, has been led by computer scientists, and in particular by Noel Sharkey. And I think his robust view of what the technology will do has had a very dramatic impact on wide perceptions, and I would say that the success of that effort is probably not as reflected in this panel as my perception around the world. I think it's going to be a very strong movement to ban, and I actually think it's going to come around back to drones and to say, if we're banning this kind of technology, let's ban, and in fact, the experience with drones and using drones in what, in my political estimate or my legal estimation, is inappropriate situations is having a very strong effect on the fully autonomous robotic systems. Noel and I disagree, I think, fundamentally about why fully autonomous systems should be banned, although I am eventually coming to the view that they must be, and probably drone technology as well, is because of the prospect that not only will robotic systems select and target without human intervention, it's the learning capacity to do the selection months or years after the programming, and then it's up to the computer to decide that this is a situation in which resort to military force is appropriate. That is Noel Sharkey says we will never get to that level of computer capability. I'm not willing to risk it, given the experience of our history with much less sophisticated systems.
Yeah, it's interesting you should mention Noel. I know him very well. I've had a lot of discussions with him, and I'm not sure if most people realize this, but Noel, I'm not sure if he still does it actually, but at one point in time he was broadcasting a show on Sunday afternoons out of Sheffield. It was called The Sound of Science. And we actually have one of his recordings, I think it was like episode 6, where he was talking to Dr. Peter Asaro, who was at that time at Rutgers. And the two of them were discussing my approach to the situation. And I actually have him on audio saying, I like John's approach very much.
Nancy, you want to comment on anything? Or do we wrap it up?
No, I think that's right, that there is definitely a sense that this could become a real they could capture the imagination of publics outside of the United States, perhaps much more so than it has done here. And I think it's really interesting where you say that it may be that it comes back around to the drones discussion.
All right. I see no one else at the microphones, but I see a hand right now. But can I ask you to get to the mic or speak so loud that everyone can hear you?
I think everyone can hear me when I talk like this. I'm Jordan Powell. I just was wondering, is the pushback from some countries that find drone technology, for example, very effective as a means of warfare, is the pushback partly from countries that like to use non-state actors as proxies in wars rather than have direct confrontation with another state? Is there something to the fact that there's a developing country split here?
No.
My own observation is the same as Naz. I don't think so. I think there's a much larger uncomfortableness across the board, and it has nothing to do, I think, with particular countries that would rely on non-state groups or non-state actors to carry out their proxy missions in some way. I think there's having grown up in Germany and very much tied still into the German debate, I think that debate is very different, say, on drones. And I think we see the same sort of beginning debates on autonomy there and in other places than it is here. And I think that you can put that down to cultural traits, that certain people believe more in technology and the ability of technology to do certain things and so forth, or a skepticism rather towards that. But I don't think it's with respect to that. But I think that points to a larger thing, and I think we'll end on that point, is that our legal opinions may only matter so much, right, if they're overtaken by the court of public opinion in some way. And I think that point, I think, is what you made, Mary Ellen, that there may be a larger debate out there that certainly this particular debate is embedded in. Let me ask you to join me in thanking not only the panel here, but also one person who I haven't mentioned beforehand, and that's Gary Brown, who was tremendously helpful in putting this panel together. So thank you for coming, and thank you.